The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never been so quiet. Representatives from 100 species sat in their assigned seats, but no one spoke. No one moved. They all stared at the holographic images floating above the central platform, and they all felt the same cold fear settling into their bodies. The images showed planets burning. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were now nothing but ash and bone. Billions of lives erased in a matter of days. The swarm had returned after 10,000 years of silence, and they were hungry. High Chancellor of the Federation rose from his seat. His crystalline body caught the light and scattered it across the walls like broken glass. He was old, even by the standards of his ancient species, and his movements were slow and careful. But his voice carried across the silent hall with perfect clarity. 3 of our core worlds have fallen, he said. 17 billion of my people are dead. The swarm consumes everything in its path. Our fleets cannot stop them. Our weapons cannot kill them fast enough. They breed faster than we can fight. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone knew the stories about They were a hive mind, a single vast intelligence spread across billions of bodies. They did not negotiate. They did not conquer. They simply consumed. Every living thing on a planet became food for their endless reproduction cycle. Ambassador Perry of Earth sat in the back row where humanity had been assigned when they joined the Interstellar Compact 3 centuries ago. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent 20 years representing his species to beings who still considered humans to be primitive newcomers, and he had learned to keep his face calm, no matter what he heard. But even he felt his stomach tighten as continued speaking. We have run the calculations, the High Chancellor said. At their current rate of expansion, the swarm will reach the inner systems within 18 months. Within 5 years, every inhabited world in this sector will be consumed. We cannot stop this alone. The ambassador stood up. His people were massive, covered in natural armor plating that could stop most projectile weapons. They had been the military power of the galaxy for generations. We will commit our fleets, he rumbled. The do not fear battle. Shook his head slowly. We do not need your fleets, he said. We need something else, something specific. He turned and looked directly at the back row. He looked directly at Perry. We need humans. The silence in the hall changed. It became confused, uncertain. Whispers began to spread through the crowd. The ambassador made a sound that might have been laughter. Humans, he said. You want the soft ones, the small ones. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no psychic abilities. What could they possibly offer against the swarm? Perry felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He kept his expression neutral, but inside he was just as confused as everyone else. They had never shown any respect for humanity. They had voted against human membership in the Compact. They had blocked human expansion into resource-rich systems, and now they were asking for human soldiers specifically. Raised one of his 6 hands and the whispers stopped. 40 years ago, he said, there was a minor incident on our border. A small scouting force emerged from deep space and attacked a mining station. The station had a mixed garrison, warriors, psychics, guards, and 1 squad of human contractors. Perry remembered that incident. It had been classified, buried in military archives. He had never known the full details. The swarm scouts overwhelmed the station in hours, continued. The fell first. Their armor meant nothing against acid and claws. They broke under the psychic pressure of the hive mind. My own people lasted 2 days before their minds shattered, but the humans held their position for 11 days. 11 days against a force that outnumbered them 100 to 1. When rescue ships finally arrived, the humans were still fighting, still holding the line. The hall was completely silent now. We studied the recordings, said. We analyzed every moment of that battle, and we discovered something that we did not understand. The humans were afraid. We could see it in their faces, hear it in their voices. They knew they were going to die, but they did not break. They did not run. They kept fighting even when there was no logical reason to continue. He turned to face the full council. We have spent 40 years trying to understand this. We have studied human history, human psychology, human biology, and we have reached a conclusion that terrifies us almost as much as the swarm itself. Perry leaned forward in his seat. Humans are not brave despite their fear, said. They are brave because of it. They have evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence. They have survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions of their own kind. They carry trauma in their very genes. And somehow, impossibly, They have learned to transform that trauma into strength. The High Chancellor looked at Perry with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. "We need soldiers who will not break," he said. "We need soldiers who have already seen the worst that existence can offer and chosen to keep fighting anyway. We need humans." Perry stood slowly. Every being in the hall watched him. He thought about the message he would send to Earth. He thought about the men and women who would answer the call. He thought about what they would face on distant worlds against an enemy that had devoured civilizations. He thought about all of this, and then he simply nodded. "You will have them," he said. 6 hours later, the message reached Earth. Admiral Carroll read it in her office overlooking the Pacific Ocean. She was 62 years old, and she had served in 4 major conflicts. She had lost friends, soldiers, and family to the darkness between the stars. She understood exactly what they were asking for. She opened her personnel files and began to search. She needed soldiers who had seen horror and kept fighting. She needed soldiers who had lost everything and still found reasons to stand. She needed soldiers who had already died inside and yet refused to stop breathing. She found them in the 71st Special Operations Division. They called themselves the Forgotten. They were the ones who took the missions no one else would take, the ones who came back from places that should have killed them, the ones who had nothing left to lose except each other. Admiral authorized the deployment order. Then she sat back in her chair and looked out at the ocean. The galaxy was about to remember why it should fear humanity. The drop pods fell through the burning sky like iron rain. Interceptors filled the space above Prime, their organic ships twisting and screaming as they hunted the small metal containers plunging toward the surface. Acid projectiles burst against the pods. Clawed tendrils reached for them. The darkness between the stars had come alive with hunger. 40 pods had launched from the carrier ship in orbit. By the time they hit atmosphere, 34 remained. By the time they touched ground, 31 had survived. Major Shaw climbed out of his pod and immediately began counting heads. The air smelled like smoke and something worse, something organic and rotting. In the distance, the capital city of the burned against the horizon. Towers that had stood for 10,000 years were now broken fingers pointing at a sky filled with enemy ships. 94 soldiers had made it down. 18 had died in the descent. Shaw noted this in his mind and moved on. There was no time for grief. There was never time for grief. His face was half covered in burn scars from a mission 3 years ago. A fuel depot had exploded while he was pulling wounded soldiers out of the fire. The medics had offered to fix the scars. He had refused. They reminded him of what he was capable of when it mattered. "Form up," he said quietly. His voice carried through the comm system to every soldier in the landing zone. "We move in 10 minutes. The soldiers of the 71st gathered their equipment with quick, practiced movements. They checked their weapons. They counted their ammunition. They looked at each other with eyes that had seen too much and still managed to focus on the task ahead. Sergeant Maria approached Shaw with a portable scanner in her hand. "Sir," she said, "command is 3 clicks east. They have a defensive perimeter established around the government district." Shaw nodded. He had read the briefings during the descent. General was in command of the remaining forces. The alien general had held the line for 2 weeks against impossible odds, but his troops were exhausted and dying. He was expecting reinforcements to help defend the capital. Shaw had other plans. The march to the command center took 40 minutes. They moved through streets filled with rubble and bodies. Some of the bodies were, their crystalline forms shattered and dark. Others were drones, creatures the size of large dogs with too many legs and mouths filled with needle teeth. The humans stepped over both without slowing down. General met them at the entrance to the command bunker. He was 12 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished stone. His eyes moved across the human soldiers with obvious confusion. "This is your force," he said, not a question, a statement of disbelief, less than 100 soldiers. Shaw looked up at the massive alien without any change in his expression. "We lost 9 pods in the descent," he said. "The rest of us are ready for deployment." Made a sound that might have been frustration. "I requested an army," he said. "I was told humanity would send their finest warriors. I expected thousands, tens of thousands, not this." "Step forward." Her dark hair was cut short and her eyes were hard. "With respect, General," she said, "you asked for soldiers who would not break. You got them." The general stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and gestured for them to follow him inside. The command center was filled with holographic displays showing the tactical situation across the planet. Red markers indicated hive positions. There were hundreds of them, spreading across the continental mass like a disease. Blue markers showed defensive positions. There were far fewer of those, and they were shrinking every hour. Pointed to the largest red marker, located in a mountain range 50 kilometers north of the capital. The primary hive, he said. The queen established her spawning chamber there 3 days ago. She is producing 10,000 new drones every hour. As long as she lives, the swarm will continue to grow. Shaw studied the display. How many defenders do you have in the capital? 12,000 said, down from 40,000 when the invasion began. And how long can you hold? The general's stone face did not change, but something in his voice broke slightly. 3 days, he said, perhaps 4. Then the swarm will overwhelm us and the capital will fall. Shaw nodded slowly. Then he pointed at the primary hive marker. We will attack here, he said, tonight. The silence in the command center was absolute. Every officer turned to stare at the small human with the burned face. Spoke first. That is impossible, he said. The hive is defended by millions of drones. The tunnels extend for kilometers underground. No force could penetrate those defenses. Shaw looked at him calmly. You asked for humans because we do not break, he said. That is true, but there is something else about us that your intelligence reports did not mention. What is that? We do not defend, we attack. We always attack. No matter the odds, no matter the cost. That is how we survived on our world. That is how we will survive here. He turned to, Sergeant, prepare the squads for night operations. We move at sunset. Stepped forward. His massive form blocked the light. This is suicide, he said. You will accomplish nothing except throwing away your lives. Shaw looked up at the alien general. His face showed nothing. No fear, no doubt, no hesitation. You have been fighting the swarm for 2 weeks, he said. In all that time, have you ever attacked them? Said nothing. They expect you to defend, Shaw continued. They expect you to hide behind walls and wait for death. They have never faced an enemy that runs toward them instead of away. He smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. Let us show them what fear feels like, he said. That night, 94 human soldiers disappeared into the darkness. They carried chemical propellant weapons that they considered primitive. They carried blades and explosives and medical supplies for wounds they expected to receive. They carried no illusions about their chances of survival. At dawn, the screaming from the nearest hive fell silent. Smoke rose from the tunnels. Bodies of drones lay scattered across the mountainside in numbers beyond counting. The humans emerged from the darkness covered in blood and ichor. They had lost 11 soldiers in the assault. They had killed over 40,000 drones, and behind them the hive burned. General watched the footage from surveillance drones and felt something he had never felt before in his long military career. He felt hope. The swarm mind had existed for 10,000 years. It had consumed hundreds of worlds. It had absorbed the memories and knowledge of countless species into its vast collective consciousness. It understood fear as a tool, as a weapon, as something it created in others. It had never understood fear as something it might feel itself. But now, as it turned its attention toward the small creatures that had burned one of its hives, the swarm mind felt something unfamiliar stirring in its ancient thoughts. These humans were wrong. They did not behave like prey. They did not behave like any species the swarm had ever encountered. The mind sent probes across the battlefield. Billions of eyes watched. Billions of ears listened. It needed to understand these creatures. It needed to find their weakness. It found one of them alone. Private Grant had been separated from her squad during the night assault. A tunnel collapse had cut her off from the others. She had spent 6 hours fighting her way through the darkness, killing drones with her knife when her ammunition ran out. When the swarm finally captured her, she had 17 wounds and she was still trying to fight. They brought her to a processing node deep beneath the mountains. The chamber was vast and organic, its walls pulsing with the slow rhythm of the hive. Thousands of drones lined the walls, their compound eyes reflecting her image back at her 1,000 times. In the center of the chamber sat a creature unlike the drones. It was larger, its body thick with neural tissue. This was a speaker, a specialized organism designed to communicate with other species before they were consumed. It existed so the swarm mind could ask questions, so it could understand its prey before destroying them. The speaker looked at with eyes that held an intelligence far older than humanity itself. "You are afraid," it said. "The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. We can taste it in your blood." Was strapped to an organic table. Her weapons were gone. Her armor was shattered. Blood ran from a dozen wounds that the swarm had not bothered to treat. She looked at the speaker and said nothing. "We do not understand you," the speaker continued. "Your species is weak. Your bodies are fragile. You have no natural defenses. Yet you attacked our hive. You burned our children. You fought when you should have run." Laughed. It was a harsh sound in the pulsing darkness of the chamber. "You think we are weak," she said. "You have no idea what we are." The swarm mind pressed against her thoughts. It was a psychic species, capable of breaking the mental defenses of most beings within seconds. It had shattered masters. It had crushed generals. It pushed into his mind expecting to find the same fragile barriers. Instead, it found something else entirely. It found memories. A grandmother dying in a hospital bed while a child watched and could do nothing. A car crash on a rainy night that took a brother too young. Years of poverty in the flooded ruins of a drowned city. Hunger and fear and loss and grief, layered upon each other like sediment at the bottom of an ocean. The swarm mind pushed deeper, searching for the breaking point. Every species had one. Every mind had a limit beyond which it could not function. But as it pushed deeper into its memories, it found something it did not expect. It found that the breaking point had already been reached. It had been reached years ago, decades ago. Gran had been broken by her own world long before the swarm ever touched her. And she was still fighting. How, the speaker asked. The voice had changed. There was something in it now that might have been confusion, or might have been the first trembling edge of fear. "How do you continue? You carry wounds that should have destroyed you. Your mind is full of pain that should have left you paralyzed. How are you still functional?" Looked at the alien creature. Blood ran down her face from a cut above her eye. Her body was failing. She could feel herself dying, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Because we have to be," she said. "Because giving up was never an option. Because the only way out is through. That is what it means to be human." The swarm mined from her thoughts. It had absorbed the memories and emotions of countless species, and it had always found the same thing. Every being had a point where the pain became too much, where the fear became overwhelming, where the mind simply shut down rather than continue to suffer. Humans had that point too, but they had learned to reach it and keep going anyway. They had built their entire civilization while carrying wounds that would have crippled other species. They did not avoid pain. They did not run from fear. They simply accepted these things as part of existence and continued moving forward. The swarm mind understood something then, something that changed everything. These creatures could not be broken because they were already broken. They could not be made to fear because they had lived with fear their entire lives. They could not be consumed because they had already consumed themselves and found a way to survive it. 3 kilometers away, Lieutenant Peter Brooks led the rescue team through a collapsing tunnel system. They had detected signal deep within enemy territory. Standard protocol said to write her off as lost. Brooks had never cared much for standard protocol. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a previous engagement. He had taken shrapnel in his back that still caused him pain when it rained. He had watched friends die in wars that most people back home had already forgotten. None of that mattered right now. One of his soldiers was alive behind enemy lines, and he was going to bring her home. The tunnel collapsed behind them. Brooks made a decision without hesitation. "Keep digging," he said. "We go through." His team started cutting through the rubble with tools and bare hands. The drones would detect them soon. The swarm would send thousands of bodies to stop them. It did not matter. They reached 20 minutes later. She was barely conscious, her body held together by nothing but willpower and spite. Brooks lifted her over his shoulder and turned back toward the surface. Behind them, the speaker watched with eyes that no longer held confidence. Above them, the swarm mind sent a message across its vast network, a message that had never been sent before in 10,000 years of conquest. "Withdraw," the mind commanded. "Retreat from this sector. Do not engage these creatures directly." For the first time in its ancient existence, the swarm had found something it could not consume. It had found something that made it afraid. The tunnels beneath Prime had been carved by the swarm over 3 weeks of constant expansion. They stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a maze of organic passages that pulsed with the life of the hive. At the very center of this maze sat the primary queen, the mother of this entire branch of the swarm. She had spawned billions of children across a dozen worlds. She had consumed civilizations that had existed for longer than humanity had been walking upright. She was ancient and powerful and utterly confident in her purpose. Today, she would learn the meaning of fear. Major Shaw crouched at the entrance to the tunnel system with what remained of the 71st, 63 soldiers. They had lost 31 in the past week of constant fighting. Every one of them had been buried properly, their names recorded, their personal effects gathered to be sent home. The humans did not leave their dead behind. Galactic observers had arrived the previous day. 12 species had sent representatives to document the human military campaign. They floated above the battlefield in shielded observation pods, recording everything for the archives of the Council. Observer of the watch through sensors that could detect emotional resonance. Her species was psychic, able to feel the emotions of other beings across great distances. She had expected to feel fear from the humans. She had expected to feel desperation and hopelessness as they prepared to enter a tunnel system filled with millions of enemies. Instead, she felt something else entirely, something that made her ancient mind tremble. She felt determination, pure and absolute and utterly without compromise. These humans knew they were going to die, many of them, perhaps most of them, and they had accepted this. They had made peace with it. They were going to die, and they were going to make that death mean something. Shaw addressed his soldiers one final time before they descended. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "We all know what is waiting for us down there," he said. "We all know that some of us will not come back. But the Queen dies today. The spawning stops today. The people of this world get a chance to survive because of what we do in the next few hours." He looked at each of them in turn, with her hard eyes and steady hands, with his communication equipment strapped to his back. Grant, barely recovered from her captivity, insisting on returning to the fight. Brooks with his missing fingers and his stubborn refusal to stay behind. They were broken people, all of them. They carried scars both visible and invisible. They had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and they were still here, still fighting, still willing to walk into the darkness one more time. "For the forgotten," Shaw said. "For the forgotten," they answered. They descended into the tunnels. The fighting began almost immediately. Drones came at them in waves, climbing over the bodies of their fallen siblings to reach the humans. The narrow passages worked in the soldiers' favor. The swarm could not bring its numbers to bear effectively. The humans used explosives to collapse sections of tunnel behind them, cutting off reinforcement routes. Sergeant held her for 17 minutes while the rest of the team pushed forward. She took wounds to her arm, her leg, her side. She kept firing until her rifle jammed. Then she drew her pistol. When that ran empty, she pulled her knife. The last drone to reach her position died with her blade in its throat. Slumped against the tunnel wall, her blood mixing with the ichor of the creatures she had killed. She could hear the others moving deeper into the hive. She could hear the distant sound of gunfire and explosions. She smiled. Her job was done. The path was clear. Shaw found the Queen's chamber after 2 hours of fighting. The cavern was enormous, filled with the organic machinery of reproduction. Egg sacs lined the walls, each one containing dozens of unborn drones. The air was thick with chemical signals that made his eyes water and his skin burn. The Queen herself was massive. Her body stretched across the center of the chamber, a mountain of flesh and chitin and ancient malice. Smaller organisms attended to her, feeding her, cleaning her, carrying away the endless stream of eggs she produced. She looked at Shaw with compound eyes that held an intelligence older than human civilization. She had consumed species that had mastered technologies humans could barely imagine. She had ended worlds. But she had never faced anything like the creature that stood before her now. A translator organism scuttled forward. "The Queen wishes to negotiate," it said in a voice that buzzed and clicked. "She offers territory, resources, genetic material to create a hybrid species. She offers partnership instead of conflict." Shaw looked at the Queen. His face showed nothing. "We are not interested," he said. "Why?" the translator asked. "You cannot win this war. Even if you kill this Queen, there are others. The swarm is eternal. The swarm is infinite. Why do you fight when victory is impossible?" Shaw raised his weapon. "Because you hurt people," he said. "Because you consumed worlds full of innocent beings who never did anything to deserve what you did to them. because someone has to stop you, and because we do not forgive." The translator tried to speak again, but Shaw was already firing. The battle in the Queen's chamber lasted 18 minutes. The humans lost 11 soldiers killing the attending organisms and the Guardian drones. They lost 7 more planting explosives in the egg chambers. They lost 4 more holding the exit while the charges were set. When the explosives detonated, the mountain shook. The tunnel system collapsed in on itself, burying the Queen and her billions of unborn children under countless tons of rock. Shaw emerged from the tunnels with 23 soldiers. They were covered in blood and ichor and ash. They could barely walk. Some of them could barely see through the blood running into their eyes. Above them, the observation pods recorded everything, felt tears running down her face. She had never cried before in her 300 years of life. The footage was transmitted across the galaxy. Every species saw what the humans had done. Every species saw the cost they had paid. Every species saw the determination in their eyes as they walked out of the darkness. The Queen was dead, the spawning had stopped, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. 6 months had passed since the death of the primary Queen. The Galactic Council chamber had been expanded 3 times to accommodate all the species that now wished to attend its sessions. Where once humanity had been assigned seats in the back row, they now sat at the center of the Great Hall. High Chancellor addressed the assembly with a voice that carried across the vast space. "The swarm has withdrawn from the inner systems," he announced. "Our scouts report they are moving toward the galactic rim. They are retreating from inhabited space entirely." A murmur ran through the crowd. In 10,000 years of recorded history, the swarm had never retreated. They had consumed or been destroyed. There had never been a third option. Until now. "The Federation formally requests a permanent human military presence in our territory," continued. He turned to face the human delegation. "We once considered your species to be primitive, unworthy of respect. We were wrong. You have earned your place among us with blood and sacrifice." Other species quickly added their voices. The worlds that had never shown humans anything but contempt now asked for their protection. Ambassador Perry stood to address the assembly. He was tired. He had aged visibly in the past 6 months, carrying the weight of decisions that had cost so many lives. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "We are honored by your requests," he said, "but I want to be clear about something. Humanity did not come to Prime to prove ourselves. We did not come to earn respect or gain political advantage. We came because innocent people were dying and we had the ability to help them." He looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of 100 species. "We do not want the galaxy to fear us," he continued. "We want the galaxy to know that when they are in trouble, when they face threats beyond their ability to handle alone, they can call on us. We will answer. That is who we are. That is what it means to be human." The chamber fell silent. Perry returned to his seat. Later that day, a young approached Admiral Carroll outside the council chamber. He was barely an adult by his species standards, his crystalline body still forming into its final shape. He had lost his family when the first Hive ships arrived at his. He had survived only because a human soldier had carried him to safety while the world burned around them. "How do you do it?" he asked. His voice was soft, uncertain. "How do you face such horror and not lose yourselves? How do you carry so much pain and still find the strength to help others?" Looked at the young alien. She thought about her own losses. Her husband had died in the Titan Rebellion 15 years ago. Her daughter had been taken by a plague that swept through the colonies before a cure could be found. She had buried everyone she loved and she was still here, still serving, still fighting. "We lose pieces of ourselves all the time," she said finally. "Every battle, every death, every terrible choice we have to make. We do not stay whole. No one does." "Then how do you continue?" the young asked. Smiled. It was a sad expression, but there was warmth in it. "We just keep going," she said. "That is all we know how to do. We put one foot in front of the other and we do not stop, even when it hurts, even when we want to give up. We keep moving forward because there are people counting on us, people we have never met, people we will never know. We fight for them because someone has to." The young stood quietly for a long moment. Then he bowed his head in the formal gesture of respect his people used for those they considered worthy. "Thank you," he said. 1 month later, a memorial was dedicated on Prime. It stood in the ruins of the capital city, where the fighting had been worst. The structure was made of crystal and human steel, the two materials woven together in a pattern that caught the light and scattered it across the surrounding rubble like stars. The names of the fallen were carved into its surface, names in their flowing script, human names in simple letters. 41 soldiers of the 71st Special Operations Division had died on this world. Their names stood alongside the millions of who had perished in the invasion. In death, they had become equals. Colonel Shaw stood before the memorial in his dress uniform. The burned scars on his face had been joined by new scars from the tunnel fighting. He would carry them for the rest of his life. He considered them badges of honor. He read each name slowly. Brooks. Grant had survived barely. She was back on Earth now, recovering from wounds that should have killed her 3 times over. The doctors said she would never fight again. Shaw suspected they were wrong. When he finished reading, he raised his hand in a salute. He held it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, the memorial stood silent and eternal, a reminder of what had happened here, a promise of what would happen to any who threatened innocent lives in the future. High above the planet, a scout ship hung in the darkness. It had been sent to observe, to record, to understand. The swarm mind needed to know more about these humans. It needed to find their weakness. The scout watched the memorial ceremony through sensors that could detect individual heartbeats from orbit. It watched the human colonel salute his fallen soldiers. It watched the civilians place offerings of crystal at the base of the monument. It watched the way the two species stood together, united by shared sacrifice. The scout transmitted its observations to the retreating swarm. Along with the data, it sent a recommendation that had never been sent before in the long history of expansion. Do not return to this space. Do not engage these creatures. They cannot be consumed. They cannot be broken. They have seen the worst that existence can offer, and they have not stopped fighting. They are called humans. They are the ones who do not break. And the galaxy will never forget why it should fear them. The memorial stood in the fading light of the sun. The names of the fallen glittered like stars. And somewhere, on 1,000 worlds across the galaxy, other species looked up at the sky and felt something they had never felt before when they thought of humanity. They felt safe.